Our memory of the American Revolution is dominated by those who occupied the center of the public stage. The grand theatrical figures whose oratory could sway popular assemblies, and the relentless ideologues whose letters and pamphlets provoked and maintained revolution. And, of course, the bold and intrepid military men who won our independence. This is even true of the Lee family and its contributions to the American Revolution and war to win it. Light Horse Harry Lee was the dashing cavalier of the Revolution. Richard Henry Lee was an old revolutionary, a patriot politician, a declaration signer, an independence advocate, and then a noted anti-federalist. Arthur Lee is known for his pamphleteering and is remembered for his feuding with Franklin and Congress, and William Lee was involved in that and so sometimes gets lumped in and included. But there was another Lee brother of Stratford Hall, of equal importance to Richard Henry, one of critical importance to America, because he helped keep Congress knit together and functional during the war, and indeed was chosen by his state as a member of the Second Continental Congress because he was so respected, leading to his signing the Declaration of Independence. He also kept his often irascible, difficult brothers knit together. That man, the quiet, steady anchor of the Lee family and Continental Congress, was Francis Lightfoot Lee. Known affectionately as Frank or Colonel Loudoun, a reference to his inheritance being in the then wild lands of Loudoun County, Virginia, to his siblings and his kinsmen, Francis Lightfoot occupied a unique position within the Virginia gentry in its revolutionary days. To put it simply, he detested the public arena. Though he felt called and duty-bound by the strictures of his class to serve in it, Francis was at heart an elite planter scholar who genuinely despised the compromises, vanities, and deceptions inherent in statecraft and the men obsessed with it. Much like the northern WASP elite of later days, men like Henry Adams, he found the whole arena tawdry and unbecoming of a gentleman. On one occasion, observing the petty factions and commercial greed that choked the assemblies of the new republic, he snapped, "What damned dirty work is this politics?" Francis, at heart, was too virtuous and too good a man for the dirtiness of politics, even American politics at the time, an arena so filthy it could tarnish even most sterling of souls. His own niece, the observant Alice Lee Shippen's daughter, Nancy, captured his exceptional character by noting that among a collection of brilliant but deeply volatile siblings, Frank was indisputably the sweetest of all the Lee race. His younger brother Arthur, himself dominated by suspicion and omnipresent personal conflict and feuding with everyone he met other than his brothers, looked upon Frank with an almost envious reverence, describing his temperament as the literal embodiment of calmness and philosophy itself. But in any case, serve America Francis Lightfoot Lee did, for he knew it was his duty, and his achievements in service of that duty were vast. Further, in fighting for them, while remaining true to himself rather than rolling in the mud with the political personalities of the age, Francis Lightfoot Lee became one of the most effective and universally respected, in his day, framers of the American Republic. His unbending sense of classical Republican duty, a view of public service not as an avenue for personal or familial aggrandizement, but as a severe, mandatory sacrifice required to protect the liberties of his native soil, served Francis and his memory well, which is why we must chart and preserve it. So in this episode, the last one on the Lee brothers of Stratford Hall, we will discuss the early life of Francis Lightfoot Lee at Stratford Hall and how he was taught that classical virtue that dominated his career, his lengthy exile as a frontier bachelor in the newly cleared territory of Loudoun County, where his family playfully dubbed him Colonel Loudoun, a rustic retirement that allowed him to escape the domineering, autocratic control of his eldest brother, Colonel Philip Ludwell Lee, his marriage to Rebecca Plater Tayloe, and the construction of Menokin, a private sanctuary of book-lined walls and deep personal devotion that he was ultimately forced to abandon to answer his country's call. And then we'll show how Francis became a respected and effective member of the Continental Congress between 1775 and 1779, noting why his contemporaries, great men like John Adams and Dr. Rush, even described Frank's judgment as superior to that of the much more famous Richard Henry, particularly when it came to institutional design of the sort critical to the early republic. And, of course, we'll comment on his signing the Declaration of Independence alongside Richard Henry, show his loyalty to his dearly beloved brothers, even when their character flaws put immense stresses upon him, and show why he left politics for good before the Revolution was over. So, let's get into it. Francis Lightfoot Lee entered the world on October 14th, 1734, within the high-ceilinged chambers of the castle-like Stratford Hall, arriving at a time when the master of the estate, Thomas Lee, was establishing his status as one of the great accumulators and landed gentlemen of the Northern Neck Proprietary. We covered that in our episode on Thomas Lee, which is just fascinating stuff. As the fourth surviving son of Thomas and Hannah Harrison Ludwell Lee, as we covered in our episode on the Lee brothers of Stratford Hall, Frank's early prospects were defined by his place in the birth order and the realities of estate inheritance. Particularly, both he and William Lee were taught entirely at the schoolhouse built on Stratford's grounds, while their brothers were sent to England for their schooling and finishing. Philip Ludwell, Richard Henry, and Arthur Lee were all sent across the Atlantic to receive an elite classical polishing. This lack of an English education in Francis's case, far from operating as an intellectual deficiency, allowed him to develop a remarkably independent, uncorrupted Republican perspective. Thomas Lee engaged the services of a private domestic tutor, the Reverend Mr. Craig, a rigorous and dedicated Scottish clergyman who resided within the Stratford Yard, around the schoolhouse. Under Craig's systematic instruction, Frank was thoroughly immersed in the history, languages, and moral philosophies of the ancient world, particularly Rome and Greece. He also mastered a style of concise, analytical writing and reading that well complemented the principles of civic virtue and institutional balance he was taught and then later put into practice. He was really the Republican aristocrat all around. The death of Thomas Lee in late 1750 began a long period of regional displacement for the 16-year-old. Under the terms of Thomas's will, the eldest brother, Philip Ludwell Lee, assumed immediate control of Stratford Hall as its sole executor, and his already overdeveloped haughtiness was dialed up to the maximum. Philip withheld the monetary legacies left to his brothers, forcing them into a position of financial dependency. Upon reaching his majority when he was 18, Frank escaped Philip's domestic tyranny by taking possession of a modest tract of undeveloped frontier land that had been bequeathed to him by his father, situated far to the northwest in the newly organized county of Loudoun, along the upper reaches of the Potomac River. For nearly 12 years, Frank lived out a quiet, independent existence as a frontier bachelor. Far removed from the elegant brick mansions and formal plantation balls of Virginia's tidewater gentry, he oversaw the clearing of his forests, the establishment of new leases with tenants, and the cultivation of his initial tobacco fields. His brothers in Westmoreland, namely at Stratford and later Richard Henry's Chantilly on the Potomac, as we covered in our episode on Richard Henry's life, looked upon this rustic isolation of their brother with a mixture of amusement and deep respect, playfully nicknaming Francis Colonel Loudoun, detached from Colonel Phil's domineering attitude and making a life for himself out on what was then essentially the frontier, or at least the wilds of Virginia. Frank cultivated the habits of a detached philosophical observer, spending his long evenings reading by candlelight, free from family feuds and all the rest. But the reality of life in the Virginia gentry made a permanent withdrawal from public life impossible. Francis was expected to lead those of humbler station around him, and did so. In 1758, the freeholders of Loudoun County elected the 24-year-old bachelor to represent them in the House of Burgesses. Frank assented and served his community in the colonial capital of Williamsburg, not out of a desire for political elevation, but because his family power block required his vote. He joined his brothers, Richard Henry and Thomas Ludwell, alongside a formidable network of Northern Neck cousins and relatives by marriage, along with men he met and developed relationships with while in the colonial capital. Landon Carter, for example, was one man with whom he became quite close over his years in service. While Frank rarely initiated debates or delivered long speeches from the floor, his legal training under Mr. Craig had made him highly effective as a committee man. He quietly managed the drafting of municipal statutes and monitored the colony's accounts, doing so with a cold efficiency. His being quite a pleasant young gentleman helped as well. He was much less combative than Richard Henry and got along much better with a wider variety of the colonial elite that was in Williamsburg for these meetings in the House of Burgesses. The deepening imperial crisis of the 1760s soon shattered the peaceful parochialism of Frank's Loudoun life. When the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, openly proclaiming its right to tax the colonists without their consent, Frank recognized that the liberties of his beloved native soil were facing an existential threat. So in February of 1766, traveling down the river port of Leedstown, Frank joined 5 of his brothers and more than 100 radical Patriot Northern Neck planters, such as many of the Washingtons, in signing the treasonous Westmoreland Resolves, as we covered in our episode on that crisis and Richard Henry's involvement in it. By affixing his signature to this historic document, Frank openly pledged to violently resist the execution of the Stamp Act, explicitly declaring that any officer who attempted to enforce the parliamentary tax within Virginia would be treated as an enemy of the community. The quiet frontier bachelor had joined the revolutionary vanguard. In the late months of 1768, having successfully secured his financial independence through the steady development of his western lands, the 34-year-old Colonel Loudoun decided to end his bachelor isolation. His political duties in Williamsburg had brought him into close contact with Colonel John Taylor II of Mount Airy, indisputably one of the wealthiest and most consequential oligarchs of the Virginia gentry in Richmond County and a fellow First Family of Virginia, as we covered in our episode on that collection of families. Tayloe possessed an immense fortune rooted in vast tobacco estates, iron foundries, and extensive transatlantic shipping connections, and his elegant Neapolitan stone mansion overlooking the Rappahannock River was a primary center of colonial aristocratic life. Frank began courting Tayloe's daughter, Rebecca Plater Tayloe, known affectionately to her family as Becky. In April of 1769, they were wed over the early objections of her parents because he was a good bit older than Becky. She, however, was a remarkably intelligent, very vibrant, deeply affectionate girl, just 17 years old. And despite the 17-year disparity in their ages, the union was actually quite happy. The marriage began a lifetime of profound, unyielding personal devotion. Frank found in Becky not merely a domestic companion, but an intellectual equal whose warmth and steady character balanced his own quiet, philosophical detachment. She also helped push him along in his political career and in traveling with him, particularly to places like Philadelphia, or when Congress was on the run after Philadelphia had been captured. She kept him happy and kept him participating in public life in a way that he probably wouldn't have been able to had he not been so happily married. This marriage also altered Frank's geographical positioning within Virginia. At the behest of his father-in-law, he resolved to leave his remote Loudoun estate, leaving it in the charge of an overseer and tenants, and live closer to his family and Becky's family. Always a doting dad, particularly to his favorite daughter, Colonel Tayloe bestowed upon the newlyweds a substantial grant of very fertile land, about 1,000 acres carved out of his extensive holdings in Richmond County, quite close to Mount Airy, situated along the quiet, marshy reaches of Cat Point Creek. It was on this estate that Frank and Becky built their private manor house, Menokin, which was a unique native Indian name for the area. Rather than emulating the ostentatious and very grand scale and style of Mount Airy or the baronial brick mound that was Stratford Hall, Frank designed Menokin to be elegant but restrained. The house he constructed was a substantial 2-story residence built of locally quarried sandstone and flanked by symmetrical outbuildings, surrounded by orchards and flower gardens. It was beautiful, it was grand, but it was restrained. The orchards were there because Frank and his father Thomas shared a love for orchards. Inside the thick and quiet walls of Menokin, Francis Lightfoot managed his estates with diligence and prudence while also lining his central study with an expansive collection of classical histories, volumes of common law, and contemporary French and English political treatises. That is something particularly unique about the Virginia gentry of this period. They're all wide readers and deep readers, read a great deal, collected large libraries they housed in their estates, and actually read them. In any case, for nearly 5 years, Frank lived the idealized life of a contented country squire, managing his crops quite well with precision, somewhat like George Washington, who was quite good as a planter in addition to being a politician. And he, rode through the fields with Becky, engaged in deep, unhurried literary conversations with his visiting brothers, leavened with a bit of wine, of course. This was domestic idyll, and he loved it. It was the highest expression of human happiness to him. A quiet world of love, virtue, intellectual independence that didn't require any external accolades or public confirmation. Frank was happy. This very contentment made his subsequent plunge into national politics a source of actual profound personal sacrifice for Frank. He had no desire to leave the book-lined rooms and flower-bedecked gardens of Menokin to navigate the toxic and stressful chambers of colonial resistance to imperial governance. He took no pleasure in the public spotlight and felt a visceral disgust for the vanity, ambition, and self-serving factions that dominated public life, even in Virginia at the time, but certainly in American revolutionary politics generally. So when escalating resistance to the coercive acts made a break with Great Britain appeared inevitable, Frank watched his brother Richard Henry rush into the fray with a fierce, ambitious enthusiasm that Frank just couldn't share. But his classical training remained core to his identity, his life as a Virginia gentleman, and he recognized that when a republic faced crisis, a citizen who possessed virtue could not credibly withhold his talents from the state. So, in the summer of 1775, when the Virginia Convention called upon him to leave his fields and represent the colony in Philadelphia in the Second Continental Congress, Frank Lee packed his bags and stepped into the storm, sacrificing his beloved private sanctuary to answer the dictates of public duty, acting as any Virginia gentleman of his period was trained to. Francis Lightfoot Lee arrived in Philadelphia in the late summer of 1775. Becky came with him, having been formally appointed by the Virginia Convention to succeed the aging conservative delegate Richard Bland within the Second Continental Congress. He stepped into a capital city that was teeming with military preparations, political paralysis, and general chaos. Envoys from 13 distinct colonies that were turning into states were attempting to manage an armed rebellion against the greatest military power on earth, and they didn't possess a unified treasury, an established army, even a single treaty of alliance. Frank took his seat alongside Richard Henry, entering an assembly where the Lee family name, given its patrician connotations and the involvement of its brothers in everything from pamphleteering and politics to finance and diplomacy, was already a primary target for intense factional feuding and regional jealousy. Within the crowded chambers of Congress, Frank rapidly established a unique style of political authority. While his brother, Richard Henry, routinely dominated the floor with his theatrical gestures, black silk bandage, and long, impassioned rhetorical appeals, Frank remained generally silent. He was naturally averse to public speaking, somewhat like Thomas Jefferson in that regard, actually, and never volunteered to deliver a single lengthy oration or engage in the loud and performative debates that consumed many of the legislative hours. Instead, Frank tried to be effective. He directed his energy and sterling intellect to the quiet, grinding work of committee rooms. As he saw it, these committees were where the material work of statecraft was performed and where he could do the most good, even if no accolades came from it because it was behind the scenes. He didn't really care about that. And he recognized that a revolution could not just be sustained by declarations and debates. It required the systematic organization of everything from supply lines and military funding to things like meticulous drafting of statutory codes and restoring order and government functionality to colonies turned independent states, required the maintenance of fiscal discipline. All of this was lacking in the America he found when he arrived in Philadelphia, and it was something he set out to be the one to fix. This silent, analytical manner of acting earned Frank the deep and really unbounded respect of even the most sophisticated minds in the Assembly. For example, Dr. Benjamin Rush, a fellow delegate from Pennsylvania, celebrated for his sharp and uncompromising character assessments of the founding generation, left behind a remarkable comparison of the two Lee brothers. Rush noted that despite Richard Henry's public fame, it was Frank who possessed the vastly superior intelligence, actually. He wrote, quote, "Francis Lightfoot Lee had a more acute and correct mind than his brother Richard Henry. He was a man of uncommon philosophical detachment, whose judgment was so accurate that I seldom or never knew him wrong on a matter of public policy. He did not speak on the floor, but his influence in committee was absolute." End quote. Similarly, the magisterial John Adams, a man notoriously stingy with praise, particularly for his Southern colleagues, was entranced by Frank and his unyielding character. John Adams labeled Francis Lightfoot Lee a statesman of, quote, "sound, unclouded judgment in inflexible Republican purpose," end quote. Operating within this committee network that he helped build, working generally out of public view, but doing far more of the real work of government than is remembered, it was Francis Lightfoot Lee who performed the heavy foundation-creating work of early American statecraft. Particularly, he was appointed to the powerful Board of War, a post that required him to oversee the procurement of muskets, the manufacture of gunpowder, and the distribution of baseline provisions to General Washington's shivering lines. And it should be noted, this was a position that later let Francis be the one who saved General Washington's army during the horrible winter at Valley Forge. It was starving. It had no supplies. Farmers refused to sell to it because it wouldn't pay in gold. Congress was dithering and wouldn't do anything. Francis stepped into the breach in his position on this Board of War and was the one who gave Washington's army the right to impress needed foodstuffs, draft animals, and the like, saving it from starvation. The army probably wouldn't have survived had Francis Lightfoot Lee not been in the position he was when Valley Forge happened. So important to remember. That's pretty much forgotten now, but it was critical at the time. That really exemplifies Francis's life. In any case, Francis Lightfoot Lee was also one of the primary authors charged with drafting the Articles of Confederation in committee. This was the nation's first constitutional framework, and Frank labored for months to design a federal structure that would allow the states to cooperate effectively against the crown while preventing the dangerous concentration of executive power that he believed was a hallmark of imperial tyranny. And the Articles of Confederation, though not perfect and later replaced, actually got passed and helped America function during the war and for a little bit of time after the war. And probably something like the Constitution wouldn't have passed at this point. So it was the most he could do. It was also during the tumultuous summer of 1776 that Frank's quiet commitment culminated in a really historic and quite fun fraternal alignment. When Richard Henry Lee moved the fateful Resolution of Independence on June 7th, 1776, beginning a frantic month of constitutional debate, Frank quietly managed the numbers behind the scenes, persuading hesitant middle colony delegates that a break from the crown was the only avenue to win the revolution, particularly through securing French assistance. And then, on July 2nd, 1776, Congress formally approved Richard Henry's resolution for independence. This was the day that John Adams thought would be remembered as Independence Day, not July 4th, when the Declaration came into being. And in any case, it was on August 2nd that Frank sat down at the central legislative table and, with a steady hand and clear conscience, affixed his signature to the parchment sheet of the Declaration of Independence. He stood alongside Richard Henry as he did so. Their names are right there together. And they became, and remain, the only pair of brothers in American history to sign the nation's founding charter. It's quite fun. They were connected in that regard. However, Frank's statecraft extended far beyond just this declaration of war and all the other things like it. Always a perceptive fellow, he looked toward the long-term geopolitical positioning of the American Republic, and when fierce, bitter congressional debates, per usual, regarding future peace treaty instructions rose, it was Frank who emerged as one of the key unyielding champions of Western and maritime sovereignty for America. He led the radical faction that demanded America refuse to sign any treaty with Great Britain unless the Crown explicitly guaranteed Americans two rights: the free navigation of the Mississippi River to secure the colonization of the West, and the permanent, unrestricted access to the Newfoundland fisheries to sustain the maritime commerce of New England. Frank recognized that without these two key economic arteries, the young republic would remain a crippled, dependent coalition, frozen between the mountains and the sea, something his father, Thomas Lee's Ohio Company of Virginia, had been founded to prevent, as we covered in that episode. So Frank fought for these clauses with a cold, unyielding persistence, and he proved that his general silence on the floor was not a cover for mental impotence, but rather a mask behind which sat a very formidable intellect. Throughout his lengthy residence in Philadelphia, Frank functioned as the emotional and administrative bedrock of the entire volatile Lee family power block. His brothers were scattered across the Atlantic world, Arthur launching his investigations and diplomacy in Paris, feuding with Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane and Edward Bancroft as he did so. William was attempting to navigate the hostile courts of Germany and negotiate with the Dutch, despite not having authorization to do so. And Richard Henry was fighting his public battles everywhere, constantly. It was Frank who remained the center of the Lee family communications network and kept the brothers knitted together and functional. For example, the already overburdened Francis managed the complex domestic business affairs and agricultural accounts of William's inherited estates, while his brother was absent over in Europe. So he managed the collection of tobacco rents and protected William's property from wartime inflation. William was quite grateful, looking upon this fraternal stewardship with gratitude, writing explicitly to Frank, quote, "I shall be doubly bound to you forever for your quiet, steady care of my fortunes while I am in exile," end quote. Frank's loyalty to his siblings was subjected to a very severe and dramatic test in the summer of 1777. Driven by a bitter convergence of regional jealousy and commercial rivalry, a powerful mercantile faction within the legislature, spearheaded by allies of Silas Deane and Robert Morris, who were already furious with the Lees over ongoing disagreements with Arthur and William Lee, as we covered most recently in our Life of William Lee episode, launched a smear campaign against Richard Henry Lee. These Virginia legislature delegates who were working with Northerners like, again, Silas Deane and Robert Morris, falsely accused Richard Henry Lee of essentially treasonous financial practices, claiming that he had ordered his tenants to pay their rents and depreciated paper currency while refusing to accept anything but silver for his own transactions. They also accused him of only accepting rent in crops rather than in the currency. On and on it went. These charges were designed to destroy his reputation among the freeholders and show that he wasn't really committed to the American project. He wanted silver. He wanted anything other than continental dollars. It was false. And in a sudden partisan maneuver, the legislature voted Richard Henry out of his seat within the Continental Congress based on these slanderous lies. When news of this betrayal reached Philadelphia, Frank reacted with fury, and the fury shocked his colleagues, as he was generally one to keep his emotions in check. Outraged by the malice of his brother's detractors and the way they were harming America just out of personal vendettas, Frank refused to participate in an assembly that would condone such a smear. Along his colleague from Virginia, Man Page Jr., Frank resigned his own congressional seat in open protest, giving up the prestige of it, walking out of the chamber gates and returning to Virginia to stand by his brother. He refused to return to Congress until Richard Henry was granted a formal public hearing before the General Assembly, and this investigation regarding the rent rolls and currency and silver and everything completely cleared Richard Henry's name and exposed the falsity of the charges. Only when his brother's honor was vindicated did Frank consent to resume his seat, demonstrating to the nation and its representatives that the fraternal alignment of the Lees was unbroken, an iron wall, at least as it came to matters of honor and virtue and respect. But despite this profound familial loyalty, Frank wasn't a blind partisan or mere political hack for his elder brother. He possessed an independent philosophical compass, and when the future stability of the United States was at stake, he didn't hesitate to break from his own dynasty, from his own brothers. This divergence manifested itself the most during the debate over the ratification of the Constitution in 1787 and 88. Richard Henry Lee looked upon the document with visceral alarm, viewing the creation of a powerful federal executive and standing national army as a fatal replication of British imperial tyranny. He might even have authored the fierce letters from the federal farmer, though authorship is unclear. We've covered that before. In any case, Richard Henry was one of the chief voices of anti-federalist resistance in Virginia. Frank saw the document through a different lens, one that was far more realistic. His years on the Board of War and Treasury committees had convinced him that the loose, decentralized framework of the Articles of Confederation, which he had been intimately involved in drafting, he thought that was fundamentally incapable of preserving the Republic. He recognized that without a centralized federal authority capable of regulating international commerce, enforcing public treaties, raising national revenue, the young nation would just dissolve into fiscal chaos and civil war, and it would probably fall easy prey to European empires. So, breaking cleanly from the family bloc, Frank decided to throw his still large regional influence behind the Federalist movement, aggressively lobbying his northern neck neighbors to vote for immediate ratification. He was aligned with Light Horse Harry, cousin, on this issue. So, though he aided his brothers wherever he could, Frank was still his own man. But that was to skip ahead in his life. It was in the late months of 1779 that Frank left Congress. The grinding logistical anxieties, relentless factional warfare, and all the rest of the Continental Congress had exhausted Frank's physical strength and his patience. So, having successfully secured the French alliance, stabilized the Army supply lines at Valley Forge, as mentioned, and defended the integrity of Virginia's borders, he thought his duty of self-sacrifice on behalf of his state and country was fulfilled. Exhausted by the politicking, disgusted by the self-serving behavior exhibited by many in Philadelphia, furious at how his brothers had been treated by an ungrateful Congress, and feeling that he had done enough for the nation, Francis flatly refused to accept any further public appointments or re-election to the federal councils. Turning his back permanently upon the political stage, Frank returned to the quiet sanctuary of Menokin with immense relief. For the next about 2 decades, Frank and Becky lived out a quiet, idolized twilight, far removed from what Frank frequently dismissed as the knavery, stupidity, and dirty work of public life. They managed their estate as a model of rural Republican elegance and virtue. Frank returned to his beloved books, spending his days reading, corresponding with his favorite nieces and family members, welcoming his surviving brothers to the hospitable table of Menokin. He had slipped out from under the shadow of history, transforming himself back into a content country squire whose private virtue didn't require external validation from the republic he had helped construct, and in some ways was disgusted by. He loved America. He loved what he had built, but he was also disgusted by the types in Congress who had smeared him, smeared his brothers, acted without virtue. Also during this time in retirement, Francis Lightfoot and Becky Lee took in the daughters of William Lee, whose mother had died, their mother had died before she could cross back to America from Brussels upon the conclusion of the war. You see, William had come ahead to put their Greenspring estate, which was her family's that he inherited from marriage to her because she had no brothers, in order. And shortly after he left, Hannah died, leaving her 2 girls without a mother. William, whose health was failing and who was rapidly going blind, actually, arranged for the girls to return to Virginia in 1785. He then placed the girls in the care of Frank and Becky. They had never had children, though they seemed to have wanted them. And they took the 2 girls in, virtually adopting them. It was a happy end to their years. So fulfilling the dying wish of their mother, Hannah, who had wanted Becky to raise her girls if she died, Portia and Cornelia Lee, daughters of William Lee, were raised at Menokin and remained there for over a decade, even after their father William died in 1795. This was yet another display of the devotion, the familial devotion that defined the lives of Francis and Becky Lee. The extraordinary and poetic nature of Frank and Becky's personal devotion to each other was destined to manifest itself one final time in their final hours. In the exceptionally bitter winter of 1797, a severe respiratory epidemic swept through Virginia. Francis Lightfoot Lee fell catastrophically ill, his lungs filling with a debilitating fluid that rapidly exhausted his remaining physical strength. Becky, refusing to leave his side or delegate his care to domestic attendants, spent days and nights nursing him, exposing her own fragile health to the malignant chills of the Menokin chamber. In the process, she contracted his severe illness. It killed her first. Becky died inside the walls of Menokin in early January 1797 at the age of 45. This loss of his domestic anchor, his beloved wife, dealt Frank a mortal psychological blow, and he didn't recover. Heartbroken, broken in spirit, Frank lacked any remaining will to maintain his life, and just 10 days later, on January 17th, 1797, Francis Lightfoot Lee followed his beloved wife in death, exiting the world at the age of 62. They were laid to rest side by side within the Tayloe family cemetery at Mount Airy, under the shade of the old Richmond County oaks. Frank Lee left behind no grand public monuments, no collection of published orations, no political machine to preserve his name. He was a man who didn't really care for fame, for power. He had enough wealth and didn't see the need to expand it. He was a reluctant patriot who looked upon statecraft as a dirty necessity rather than some grand personal honor. Yet, by voluntarily sacrificing his beloved private ideal to perform the silent, unheralded, uncelebrated, largely, labor of the nation's founding in committing rooms and standing by and supporting his brothers as they battled it out in the public eye, Frank's quiet strength remains permanently woven into the material foundations of the American Republic. So thanks for listening. That does conclude our series on the Lee brothers of Stratford Hall. As described earlier, many of them didn't have children that did much. Richard Henry kind of did, but they faded, as we covered in our episode on him. Frank, of course, didn't have kids. Williams didn't go on to do much. So that really ended the Stratford line. Colonel Phil's son had died early, and he left behind two daughters, one of whom married Henry Lee, a light horse Harry, as we'll cover soon. So that takes us to the Leesylvania line of Lees, away from Stratford Hall, which really terminated with this grand outburst of revolutionary sentiment and then faded from sight. And we'll cover what happened to Stratford in the future, as that's tied to the history of Light Horse Harry and his son Black Horse Harry. And I'm excited to cover that, and that will lead us to Robert E. Lee and Robert E. Lee's children, and then end the Lee series in a couple episodes. So I'm excited to do all that and to move on from Stratford to the other branch of the family. Thank you for listening. Thank you so very much for making it to the end. Since you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video or tap the heart, whatever it is on the platform on which you're listening. Share it around with people who might be interested. That's how we grow. That's how we keep this going. But thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.